It's helpful to look upon this week here and realize that everything that happens during this week is part of the retreat and is helpful, even if it doesn't look like that on the surface. Include everything and realize that it's all part of the teaching. That includes the bus trip from hell. It includes discomforts, strange food that you are not used to. Bugs that you may encounter here or there, or other animals, and your physical body. Some of you are experiencing the limitations of that here. And whatever condition arises, inside or outside, it's part of your practice. One can live like that. At the moment I'm just saying make it part of your retreat here, where nothing is denied or resisted, including physical weakness, physical pain, or physical discomfort. Just relax into that. Only the condition of this moment. Otherwise, you may go home frustrated and say, I went to this retreat expecting to encounter spiritual liberation, the limitless, the transcendent and eternal, and all I encountered was sickness, strange food, bus trips from hell, bugs. That wasn't supposed to happen. Of course, you also encountered other things, but it's easy for the mind to focus only on that. In other words, limitations all around. And when you get home, you encounter the normal limitations of everyday life again. So here would be pointless to try and eliminate the limitations. We looked at it before. Use the limitations as the doorway. It's easy to forget. There's a little spider. On its journey somewhere. So every limitation becomes a doorway when you don't turn away from it, criticize it, blame it, judge it, good, bad, usually bad. So whatever it is, I put it like that in the book. Whatever this moment presents to you, accept it as if you had chosen it. That is a totally new way of living and totally contrary to the old conditioned consciousness. Accept this moment, no matter what it brings, as if you had chosen it. I am not saying that you did choose it. Maybe you did. If I say you chose it, that would require belief on your part. You can believe it or not believe it. And some of you would say, I definitely did not choose this. I know that for sure. So although in some New Age teachings you hear, whenever you come to a person who has read these books and been to workshops, and you come and say, this is what's happening to me, or that's happening to me, they will ask, why did you manifest that? And then you already begin to feel a little bit guilty. Oh, I must have made some mistake somewhere. I manifested this. Not good enough yet. So I don't say you chose it. It's enough to say, as if, except as if you had chosen it. Oh. And immediately the limitation becomes a doorway into peace. That's the miracle. No matter what condition you surrender to, accept fully, that very condition takes you into deep peace. But if the condition is on the surface, appears on the surface, totally unacceptable, then the surrender would have to be correspondingly deep. The depth of surrender reflects the condition. So a little condition may be a discomfort in your stomach. A larger condition, you're confined to bed. Can't come to the talks anymore. You're missing out on the whole thing. And yet, here the surrender will have to be a little deeper. And then you can encounter conditions that seem dreadful on the surface. Nobody could accept that. An illness that immobilizes you forever, perhaps, testifies what the doctors say. Death of loved ones all around you. Loss of everything. Prison. And then the surrender, the yes to this moment, will be very deep. And so the peace that then comes, if you find that deep yes in the face of seemingly unacceptable conditions, and to some people the threshold of unacceptable isn't very high. They very quickly reach the unacceptable. Some of you may have a few times during this week reached the threshold of the unacceptable, and yet it wasn't that much, but the reaction was as if it were huge. Perhaps it was huge if you had used to an extremely comfortable existence. And this is why it has happened. Certain people who were faced with the unacceptable, even when they never have heard any spiritual teaching before, they entered the surrendered state of consciousness, and the yes arose in the face of the unacceptable. And that yes had to be so deep that that peace, all the reactive structures of the egoic self collapsed in that one deep yes. And the peace then never left them. They dwelled in that eternal peace. Those were the first, thousands of years ago, the first spiritual teachers that arose. They didn't have teachers because they must have started somewhere. The first spiritual teachers that arose were those people who were faced with the unacceptable, great suffering, and then a deep yes. The depths of that yes reflected the depths of the suffering and of the limitations that they encountered. And that was the shift. And then after a while, people came and said, there's something strange about you. I don't know what it is. I feel drawn. What is it that you have something that I don't have? I want that. And they said, well, I know. And then gradually some teaching started coming out of their mouths. A few pointers, gradually. And later on perhaps they had an insight into what had happened to them. And then the teaching says, you don't need to go to the depths of despair, to an extreme form of limitation or suffering. Surrender can happen as a voluntary yes. You don't have to be pushed into it by life, although eventually life would push you into it. Time. All that spiritual teachings do is they save time. By the grace of God. Otherwise it gets drawn out, goes on and on. All the old patterns playing themselves out again and renewing themselves, including the pain body. So if you bring in continuous little acts of surrender in the face of relatively small limitations, then gradually you enter the surrendered state. With every yes, there's a deepening. With every yes, there's a weakening of the egoic mind structures. So everything is included. Whatever arises now is part of this retreat. And when you go away from here, is part of your spiritual practice. There's nothing that is not part of it. Oh no, not this. No, give me something else to surrender to. This one, no, I don't want. I need a more secure life situation so that I can start my surrender practice. And the mind saying, and this is also a subtle thing, I need to understand more before I can surrender. Please explain more about surrender. I have accumulated enough knowledge about it. Just one more question now about surrender. Oh, well, then the answer comes, But then on the other hand, what about, of course there's no end. Now surrender is the doorway into presence. May I also suggest not only that you work with whatever happens, apply the yes. Remember the beautiful statement by the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius that I quote in the book. Marcus Aurelius was this very strange case of a wise man who had also worldly power. It's very rare that these two go together, extremely rare. So he said in his beautiful little book that is now called Meditations, written 2,000 years ago, accept all that comes to you woven in the pattern of your destiny, for what could more aptly fit your needs? Whatever comes to you is woven in the pattern of your destiny, which is the pattern of the totality of the cosmos. It appears as the form that this moment takes. What could be better? What could more aptly fit your needs than that which comes to you woven in this pattern of the totality, which appears as now? And so whatever it is here, and if you cannot come to a talk, that will be greater for you than the talk, if you surrender into that condition. But then you can observe the complainer. I'm missing out. Here I am, spend all this money on this long trip, and here I'm in bed, and it's not even comfortable. And the self-talk continues. It's even happened last year. We had a retreat in Costa Rica, and one person who had come from the other side of the planet to come to this retreat, halfway between where he lives and where Costa Rica is, he got arrested, and they put him in prison for 2 months. Later all the charges were waived, but he didn't know that then. That was his retreat. And it was better than the retreat in Costa Rica would have been. Far greater deepening happened. First, much more suffering than could ever have been generated even by the most uncomfortable retreat. And then, in the face of the suffering, surrender happened. And then he realized later, not immediately, that that was the best that could ever have happened to him. So that's this enormous power that is released through welcoming now. And then it becomes uncompromising. An uncompromising welcoming that is both, it has both a feminine and masculine aspect to it, that welcoming. The feminine aspect of welcoming whatever arises is what you sometimes see in statues of the Virgin Mary, Kuan Yin, perhaps also. The arms like that, often which is the feminine principle of embracing all. So that is one aspect of welcoming what is you have to become the one that embraces all. You realize yourself as the field that allows this to be, the space. And then welcoming also has a fierce, another, one could say, more masculine aspect, which is like that. It has the certain fierceness to it also. It is uncompromising, the yes to what is. The two combined, it seems impossible, but they merge into one. And with that you meet whatever arises in your life with that gentle fierceness. You meet and face whatever arises in your life. And of course, it can only arise now. That's all there ever is. Whatever arises in this field, with that gentle fierceness, is embraced, received, met. And then enormous transformation happens. First, the entire state of consciousness shifts from resistance, ego, to complete openness, where the self, the one self, not the limited little mind-made self, that one consciousness then becomes free-flowing, so to speak. And it acts for you, speaks for you. Life unfolds. Life suddenly seems to carry you, where before you struggled against it, now you're floating, so to speak. It comes always as a surprise to somebody who learns to swim, that at first it's a great struggle to keep yourself above water. This is the egoic condition, so to speak. You're always struggling to keep your head above water. When is it ever going to end? I can't take any more. And then suddenly you realize that the water is actually quite friendly. It can carry you, and you can just breathe in, lie on your back, and you float. And just a few movements, and you become one with the water. You're no longer struggling against the water becomes friendly. And this is how life can become, when the shift happens from the resistant state to the surrendered state. Suddenly the universe is no longer experienced as hostile. In the egoic state, mostly the universe is a place to be feared, and a place that you also hope someday is going to deliver to you what you need. Of course it won't. So it's the uncompromising yes. And so you don't need to be worried about thoughts. How do I get rid of mental noise? There's so much going on in my head. The uncompromising yes does it. Mental noise subsides. It has a certain momentum. For a little while it's still there, and then less. And the noise that's still there is no longer a problem. Just a little bit of mental noise occasionally, okay. But watch the deep-seated pattern of the mental noise, the deep-seated pattern associated with the egoic mind structures. They have enormous momentum behind them. Patterns of resistance. Watch particularly, there are two very important ones, and you will notice them very easily, as now that there's so much presence in you, you can notice how your mind operates unconsciously. Two very important aspects of the pattern, the resistance, the continuous resistance patterns of the egoic mind. And this is what usually creates so much suffering in relationships, so much friction and conflict, continuous source of conflict in relationships. Two main aspects of the resistance pattern is identification with mental positions and defensiveness. And you can watch that as you interact with people, how the arguments in your relationship, how many of them are to do with unconscious identification with positions of the mind that you identify with. It could be opinions, viewpoints, beliefs, ideas, perspectives, and there's an identification with this mind position as me. And then your partner has another position that conflicts with yours and identifies with that. Both are totally have their sense of self in their mental position. So the two things in relationships that usually bring about conflict in relationships is identification with the pain body and identification with mental positions. And often the two go together. The mental positions can become amplified by the pain body. Hell, it's called. So watch it, even in a simple discussion, a simple conversation, before you know it, you've put forward some position or belief or opinion or idea, and then the other person says, no, that's not how it is. And then you're beginning to defend yourself. That's the beginning of unconsciousness. It's nothing to do with you, but you believe it's you because you have identified with mind. And the moment you identify with a belief, an idea, any mental position, a perspective on something, now you have to defend, you have to fight for your very life. And it's unconscious. And you can see it everywhere. So to know, and especially as you interact with people, it's simply a position. It's a mental position. There's no self in it. It's just a perspective. And then comes defensiveness. It's totally automatic. Defensiveness comes in whenever your sense of self, which is mind-made, is threatened by something. Something somebody says. You did that. You didn't do that. You failed to do that. And you can see how automatically the self goes into protection and defense. And the enormous emotion that comes with that. And you go, if you feel the body, you feel it's totally contracted. I never said that. I never did that. You did. You are the one who is unconscious. What are you telling me? All you need to do is watch it in yourself. If the unconscious movement still operates, how quickly and automatic the process of defensiveness is. So you're defending yourself, but an illusory self. Part of that is the need to be right. Very closely associated with needing to keep your sense of self intact because your sense of self is identified with a position of rightness. And so the spiritual practice is, on the one hand, to observe this as it arises, if you can, or you observe it just after it's happened, the whole episode is over, and then you say, oh, there it was again, okay. And then perhaps next time in the middle of it you can suddenly see it. That you are trapped in defending an illusion, put beautifully in the Course in Miracles, which says, whenever you become defensive about anything, know that you have identified yourself with an illusion. Whenever you become defensive about anything, you have identified yourself with an illusion. And that means your sense of self has become associated with thought movements, which is the illusion. And then a time comes, and I suggest it is now, it's not for everybody yet, but for you, it's now, when you can relinquish a position or allow it to be there without a self in it. Say, that's the position, and that's your position. Oh, okay. When you can relinquish defensiveness and realize you're still alive, even if you don't defend yourself. You are still alive, even if you're not right. And if you say, oh, yes, you're right, I was wrong. Enormously liberating to suddenly say, oh yes, that's how it is. And then already a great freedom arises when you give up the automatic self-repair programs of the ego. And there's so much in this world that could damage the mind-made self. As you move through every day, you have to watch out continuously. Even the slightest remark from somebody can damage the mind-made self. And even when you're driving along, a driver shouting something at you doesn't feel good. You idiot, where did you get your license? Or the driver shouts something, and usually, and this is a very simple example of how one's self-image, mind-made, immediately jumps into repair, because that shouting, you idiot, has injured your mind-made sense of self, because you fear, you don't want to, you're not an idiot, I'm not an idiot. And so immediately the self-repair thing is you shout something back, even louder perhaps. And on its own level it works, because you feel a little bit better. The damage has been repaired. You've shouted back and it's been patched up. Okay. The self is intact again, and so you drive on. And this is a little example. And how often do things like that happen through criticism, somebody telling you this or that, you're not, and then occasionally you get the opposite, you lap it up, you say, you are so good, you're so great. The world may tell you that for a little while, until it changes its mind. but to observe the automatic self-repair mechanism that immediately come into place. And that, of course, can even degenerate in very unconscious people. In other words, people who are very much complete absence of a witnessing presence that need to be right. In very unconscious people, and there are many on this planet still, can degenerate into physical violence. Physical violence, even between nations, is the need to be right and the other to be wrong. Or when you're driving, you can see it as a phenomenon. I don't know if it happens in India, probably not, but in the West, road rage, where it's not confined to a physical shouting match. They actually get out of their cars and start physical violence. But it's simply a continuation of the self-repair mechanism. And so the final triumph in a very, very unconscious person, and there are many, is you have killed the other person. The self is now, the fiction, the illusion of self is now totally repaired. And then they put you in prison. But at least you have triumphed as the self. And at that moment when you're engaged in automatic and unconscious self-repair, you would go to prison for the rest of your life just to triumph in that moment. It's all worth it, says the self. But then life is very generous. It then allows you 50 years of spiritual practice in the prison cell. So when you're talking to people, watch that, whether there's identification with mental positions, defensiveness in yourself. And then the enormous freedom comes when you don't need to defend anymore. That the otherwise unconscious need to defend your sense of self is relinquished. And then, to go back to the simple example, somebody shouts, "You idiot," when you are driving, and you look and you drive on. There's nothing to repair. And then he'll shout again because he thinks you're deaf. And that's an enormous liberation, because it's the liberation from thought. It's the liberation from ego. Or the need to be right. Or just saying, "I don't know." Some people can't say, "I don't know." They must know. So you can play with that. There's enough presence in you. You can play with it. You can watch those movements when they are still there, and you can play with relinquishing that. They just fall away. It comes with the arising presence. And of course, that's the arising of spaciousness. You did that and that. You have. Oh, maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but there's space. I did? And then you look into it. Did I do that? And you say, "No, I don't think I did that." That's how you see it, but it's a misinterpretation, because that's what... Or you say, you're right, I did that. And you're free. All reactions, all reactivity in yourself is egoic. And all reaction is always some opposition. Then you go from reaction to response. You respond out of presence to the situation. Jesus used extreme examples to teach this, which is the state of non-reactivity. And he used the extreme of example of, in his parable, of turning the other cheek. Somebody hits you on the cheek. Now, the normal reactive pattern is to immediately hit that person back. That's normal. Of course, it's a parable. It's used as a metaphor. And so he says, when somebody hits you on the cheek, you offer the other cheek. It's a very extreme example of non-defensiveness and non-reaction. Not necessarily to be taken literally, or perhaps, but it's a parable. Another beautiful parable, which I've told, some of you know it, from Zen Buddhism. The Zen master, with a high reputation, who lived in a town in Japan, was accused by a 16-year-old girl who was pregnant of being the father. So this girl was pregnant and told her parents that the Zen master, whom she had visited some months ago, was the father of her child. The child she was carrying. She told this to her parents. The parents ran to the Zen master, accusing him of having seduced their daughter, of being a false teacher, of being a fraud. And he listened. He said, "You fathered this child. She just told us." And he listened, and they kept talking, and all he would say was, "Is that so?" "Yes, you are the father of this child." "Is that so?" "Yes." And then the child was born, and the parents didn't want the child, so they brought the baby to the Zen master and said, "Here's the baby, you look after him. We don't want it, it's your child." And the Zen master said, "Is that so?" And so the parents went back home, and the Zen master, nobody would come to see him anymore because he lost his reputation. All he had to do is look after the baby. And he did that because it was there. And he welcomed the form that this moment took. He didn't live through a mind-made self. So a lost reputation didn't become a mental story in his head that he derived his continued sense of identity from. The only fact was, here's the baby. Nobody's coming to see me anymore. There's nobody here, and that's fine. Nobody is not a problem whatsoever. Just there's a baby and empty space. It's beautiful. There's no mind-derived identity which says, all what I've built up, my reputation is gone, my life is in ruins, what did they do to me? They did that to me. Nobody did anything. He just non-reacted, welcomed this moment. A year later, the daughter became more mature and confessed to her parents that the Zen master was not the father, but the boy next door. So the parents ran back to the Zen master and said, "Can you please forgive us? We just realize that you are not the father. And the Zen master said, is that so? And then they said, yes, and we'll have the baby back now, please. And he said, oh, is that so? All right, here's the baby. Nothing happened. It's an extreme example of a life lived in the state of non-reactivity and the complete absence of drama, which is egoic, in such a life. The others may be playing their drama, but in the surrendered consciousness, there is no drama. It cannot arise. And this is the amazing thing. His life remained clear, simple, totally unproblematic, because his sense of self was not derived from mind-created identifications and stories. His sense of self was derived from presence, the presence of now, the spaciousness of now, the field of now, the unconditioned consciousness. What problem could there be in that? So, through non-reactivity, one could say, to use an old expression, the buck stops here. Otherwise, and this is the end of karma, when there's non-reactivity, karma immediately evaporates. It's only through reactivity, because karma is action, reaction, action, reaction. Through non-reactivity, karma, which is surrender, karma dissolves. It may come at you, human karma. And this is the only way karma can dissolve. It doesn't dissolve through more and more time. It renews itself through time. It's only through the timeless that it becomes dissolved. So that's the power of all the teachings. Show that Jesus in Buddhism, the enormous power that comes with non-reactivity, which is surrender. The end of all drama in your life. How could there be? All right, that's how it is. It's just this. Whoosh, whoosh. It remains clear, unencumbered by problems. The field of now. And it don't let the little mind tell you that then you become a doormat. I will become a doormat. I don't want to be a doormat. It's not that there is enormous strength and power in that non-reactive state. Totally non-defensive, but enormous strength and power go through you. There's also a story about the Buddha traveling from town to town and village to village. And occasionally he encountered people who abused him because they had certain mental positions. And they would shout at him. He would always... And people would ask him, why doesn't this bother you that people are shouting at you and abusing you? And he said, there's nobody here to abuse. They think they're abusing somebody, but there's nobody here. it just passed through him. There was no mind-made entity that where this abuse was received and held. It passed through in the absence of a mind-made sense of self. Somebody shouting, "You idiot!" There's nobody there to hold on to that, and it passes through. Idiot? Where? Who? So, nothing can prevail against the power of presence. Yes, don't underestimate the momentum that is there in the collective human mind and its patterns. But it's nothing compared to the power of presence. Yes, don't underestimate the madness of the ego, but it is nothing compared to the power of presence. The Course in Miracles says, the ego is insane, and do not underestimate the extent of its insanity. And this is very true. It is very insane. Look at human history. Watch the news. I don't want to become more personal, but it's in everyone still, unless it's already dissolved. But they are operating less in you now. Those structures are becoming more less solid. As presence arises, they begin to fade. They still operate, but with less momentum. The same old patterns you will often observe have their momentum, and they still arise in your life. But as the witness is there more and more, the witnessing presence, these patterns have less force to them. So gradually they fade, become transmuted. But just taste. All that is required is just get a taste of the surrendered state, and see the beauty and power that lies in that. So people ask sometimes, how do I get rid of thousands and thousands of years of conditioning, of all the accumulations, all the collective conditioning that you carry inside? And it's so simple. Surrender. And as this transformation happens in you, people around you, you will find, are being affected by that. And others will leave you who are not yet ready. You're no longer interesting to them. You don't participate in the drama anymore. They can't use you anymore. what's the point? They leave you. He's not playing anymore. If you have a partner, then as the shift happens in you, the shift in consciousness, it will frustrate, if it's not yet happened in your partner, it will frustrate those patterns, the conditioned mind patterns, including the pain body in your partner, that need your cooperation to keep themselves going. The reactivity needs something to react against. The pain body needs another pain body to feed on. It needs your reactions. So in the absence of that, there's frustration. And then there could be a shift in your partner. It's happened. It's enough for one partner to enter the surrendered state. And then there's disorientation in the other partner for a while. And then either the openness is there and the shift will happen, or you will separate. But it will be loving. You would separate in love. And it's sometimes the most unlikely people that are suddenly open. And all it requires is to come into your presence. You might say a word or two, and their lives from then on, that's the trigger that awakens that which was already underneath all the mind structures. As somebody wrote to me, whom I met a long time ago at university, he said, "I wish I had never met you. My life would be simple, would be conventional and normal." Of course, he doesn't know that it's not true. He would be very unhappy like everybody else. One more thing about physical conditions, because some of you, I'm told, are having certain physical limitations here. Limitations of the physical body, for some people, have been their only teacher. And some had needed no other teacher, but some continuous pain or continuous disability in the body. And it drove them to the point of surrender. The very same condition in other people drove them into more and more egoic contraction and misery and unhappiness. So you can see, you can see one person in a wheelchair who is filled with anger, resentment and bitterness, and you can see another person in a wheelchair, and I have met people, and there's a light shining through their eyes and complete openness and no unhappiness and no misery. And even occasionally you might encounter people in India where many people who in the West would be shut away, they are actually visible in the street. So people who may have only one limb or lost several limbs, and occasionally you find that there's peace in them. It happens. And they smile at you. So the physical limitation then drove them into the state of surrender. If you surrender, otherwise it will drive you into more contraction. I met my brother again after 3 years, my half-brother, at Christmas, and he's now only 32 or 33 years old. And I had observed, I would see him occasionally, how his ego was growing and becoming more and more rigid over the years during his 20s. The roles, complete identification with the roles he was playing, with mental positions, and rigidity setting in. And, that's how the ego grows. And then he encountered a serious illness in his late 20s. And he had a very major operation. And then as the result of that operation, he would, for even now, almost every night he wakes up in acute pain, abdominal pain. And so his sleep is interrupted almost every night by acute pain for 1, 2, 3 hours. And that is almost, to some people, that would be called unacceptable. Never getting enough sleep, always this pain. And then I met him after 3 years at Christmas, and I could see his ego had diminished greatly, and there was enormous sweetness, openness, softness, gentleness coming through. And then only then he told me, I said, wonderful, how, I didn't say it, I thought, this is beautiful, the rigidity is gone, there is a light coming through him now, which means the conditioned somehow is no longer totally dominating him, and the unconditioned is filtering now through the conditioned. Somehow it must have happened. And then he told me that every night he wakes up in pain, and then I realized that was his teacher, and that still is his teacher. It is that drove him into surrender. And the moment surrender happened, all the conditioned structures begin to weaken. Now the beauty of this is you don't have to be pushed into surrender now by life. It's the voluntary embracing of surrender. That's the beauty of the spiritual teaching. You can choose the yes voluntarily. You choose the kingdom of heaven. You don't have to be dragged into it, kicking and screaming, no, I don't want this. Perhaps you were pushed up to this point through some suffering or some condition, pushed you here. And from now on, it's a voluntary embracing of what is now. That's all. And that is an acceleration of the emergence of presence. You don't need more suffering. Because this could be misunderstood, because I've been talking about the beauty of suffering, that it can become a teacher and push you into surrender. Suffering, the very thing that's generated by non-surrender, eventually brings about the transformation of consciousness. You see how it's all connected? Even the suffering that is generated through ego, its very purpose is the transformation of consciousness. It's even that is one with the liberation. But I'm not saying that you need more suffering now. You don't need any more suffering now. Suffering has been your teacher until now or recently. And now, that doesn't need to be your teacher anymore. Your teacher is whatever form this moment takes. And it's easy. It's always easy. This moment is always easy. When you bring the yes to it. Remember the Zen master. Whatever comes into now, he goes, oh, so that's it? Oh, all right. That's it? Is that what it is? Okay. Oh. And this is the goodness of now. So deep that it has no opposite. Good and bad are on the surface of things. The future cannot hold a greater good than now. And then you can renounce the future easily. For practical matters it still works, that's okay. But you renounce it as a psychological need. And that's a very easy renunciation when you realize the depth and goodness of now. And so you renounce the future before the future is taken away from you. That'll happen anyway. Somebody just told me that some people bought a little photo of this form. And if you did, it needs to be used with great care and rightly,